Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Brain Podcast, the one and only official podcast of the brain. I'm your host, Lars Householder, broadcasting from the sunny hills of San Juan Capistrano. And with me, as always, is Dr. Linda Eiger, an Athena Award-winning clinical neuropsychologist with 4 decades of experience in the field.
Hi, Lars. Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Linda Eiger. I'd like to say hello and hope you're having a wonderful day. If you'd like to know who I am and what I do, I'll explain. I'm a clinical neuropsychologist, and I know that's a mouthful, but it means that I have 2 doctoral degrees. One's in clinical psychology, and the other's in neuropsychology. Plus, when I was through UCI Medical School, put together a program for me to go with the psychiatry residents to learn about neuroimaging and neurobiology. And let's see, I've been practicing for 3 decades. I have published 27 journal articles of mine have been published. I am proud to say that I am 1 chapter in a textbook, medical textbook, that was published by the Canadian government called Myalgic Encephalomyelitis. It's a word and a half. What it basically was looking at was what brain changes happen in certain dementing diseases. And of course, the Athena Award, which was probably the opus in my life. It's an award given in 500 locations around the world to women who have either given community service, not just their money, but their time, their effort, or have had some kind of professional excellence that needed to be recognized. I received a lifetime achievement of professional excellence, and I'm proud to say the award is sitting in my office, and it's a beautiful statue, and it came with a book on how to be an Athena. So that was one of the high points in my life. So, Lars, where do we go from here? Where would you like to go from here today?
So the first topic we're going to be going over in this podcast is the topic of therapists. So, you want a therapist?
Most people don't know how to pick a therapist, and especially they don't know who they're picking and whether it's a match for them. Beyond that, they don't know if they're even going to like the therapist or what that therapist does. So my job today is to educate people on what is a therapist. Is there such a thing as a therapist? Which the answer is no, because it's just a generic term. But so what do these people do, and who are they? Well, if you want to pick a therapist, the first thing you have to do is figure out who does what. And so that's what I'm here to tell you today. I'm going to start out with life coaches. They require no formal training or experience. There's no board oversight. They're not trained to handle emotional distress. They have no educational requirement, and there is no agency to oversight them, nor do they carry malpractice insurance. Unless you have a life coach who has a background in something else, like they have a license as an LCSW or they have some other license, I do not recommend this if you are distressed. Because, as I said, no formal training, no formal experience required, no board oversight.
So if someone wanted to go with a life coach, is there any benefit to be had from that? Well, the benefit would be that you've got a friend that you're paying to listen to you. Aside from that, truthfully, if you're in trouble and you need a therapist because you're depressed or anxious, no. There is no benefit whatsoever. In fact, it's very risky. But if, let's just say you're looking for some just friendly vocational advice, or...
Then go to a vocational specialist.
Okay.
The next one, that's also a very generic term and means nothing, is a psychotherapist. It is a general term used out there. I'm going to go see a psychotherapist. It means absolutely nothing. It describes neither the education, the experience. There's no licensure as a psychotherapist. There is no board for psychotherapists. And another generic term that I think people get in trouble with is counselor and counseling. And they don't really know what it means. There are some licenses that include the word counselor. If that's what you're looking for, I will explain it a little bit further on about what that MFC, marriage, child, and FC, family counselor, means.
I have a question about that, by the way. What's the difference between a psychotherapist and a counselor in terms of levels of qualification?
There are none for either. They are not terms that are recognized by any agency or by any board, and they have no malpractice, there's no agency oversight, there's no licensure. These are just terms that people use to try to say that they have a credential. If, let's say, you went to graduate school and you dropped out and you decided, I'm going to call myself a psychotherapist, well, you could do that, but you're practicing illegally. You're practicing without a license. You have no malpractice. You have no recognition from any board. And if that person, the person you're seeing and trying to help, becomes more and more distressed and disturbed as you go on, you have no place to go because you're not trained for it.
So this might even be illegal in some situations.
Oh, it's quasi-legal. So that's why
okay.
I'll call it quasi-legal. It's certainly when you have a license and you see somebody put out a sign or an ad for a psychotherapist and you are licensed, it makes you cringe because other states will not allow those titles to be added unless there's something that it means, it has some meaning, it has some education and training experience requirements. The next one is a licensed social worker. This is a master's level degree in California, and it has oversight by the Board of Behavioral Sciences. The licensed social worker is not trained in testing. The licensed social worker is not trained to handle severe or even moderate individual emotional problems. So again, it's a social worker, handles social problems, family problems, interpersonal relationships. So is that kind of clear to you?
So there are legitimate reasons to go see a social worker, but not necessarily for severe issues.
Wait. The legitimate reasons would be if there was a family problem.
Okay.
Or a problem of, let's say, poverty. That's a social problem, right?
Of course, yeah.
And if you said, well, gee, I need some help because I'm out of work and my child needs books and I feel so stressed, that would be where you would go to a social worker.
But not if you're depressed or you have a brain disease or something.
Probably not a good choice. Yeah. So the next one we're moving up to, and please, Lars, ask because I think people are so confused about this. The next one is a marriage, family, and child counselor, also called an MFC, and it is exactly as it is called. It's for marriages in trouble, families in trouble, children in that family in trouble with the family, and it's another master's level degree. It's also licensed by the Board of Behavioral Sciences. They're not trained in testing. Their testing will not be accepted or recognized by the court except in some child custody issues. They're not trained to deal with individual emotional distress. And there are 200,000 plus in the state of California.
Wow, just in California alone.
So that should tell you it's easy to get to master's level. People do license as marriage and family counselors, and some of them do absolutely fabulous work, but that's where they're trained. If a marriage and family counselor wants to do neuropsych testing on you, not any good. You're paying for nothing because they're not trained or experienced in that. So 200,000 people, but they are definitely helping families. That's their job.
So exactly what it says on the tin, just nothing beyond that.
Just with the title. And they, so now we're moving on to the higher levels, the ones that require a doctoral level degree. And the first one we're going to look at is psychologists. Many in the state of California are not real. They call themselves psychologists, but they are not psychologists. So ask to see the license. It should be up on the wall or in their wallet.
I'm looking at the wall in this office, and a question I would have is, for instance, what are some of the mistakes that are made if someone's trying to present themselves as a psychologist but isn't actually?
Well, the first thing, if they're trying to present themselves as a psychologist and they are not, just ask for the license. That is just the easiest way. Or look them up. There's a board of psychology in Sacramento that has the list of all licensed psychologists. Will tell you if that psychologist holds the license, if it's current, if they've ever been sanctioned, censured, or suspended. And the same with calling up the Board of Behavioral Sciences. If you're looking for a marriage, family, and child counselor, call them up. Ask to see if that person that you're seeing is licensed and has a current license, and that license has never been sanctioned, suspended, or censured. The other thing you can look for and ask about is hospital affiliation. A lot of psychologists are affiliated with the hospital. I was practicing at South Coast Medical Center in Laguna Beach before it became Mission for 22 years. And then also still have privileges at Eisenhower Hospital in Rancho Mirage. So when you have a psychologist who has privileges at a hospital, the hospital themselves takes on to look at and check out the credentials of that person and make sure that they are who they say they are, their license is current, they have references, they've never been sued, they've never had malpractice against them, they've never been censured, sanctioned, or suspended.
Is malpractice just a complete death sentence in terms of whether you would want to go see someone or not? Like, is that a deciding factor that you should use?
Well, it's okay. The way you would look up malpractice suits is to go to the board that oversees whether it's a psychiatrist or a psychologist or the licensed clinical social workers or the licensed social workers or the MFCs. You go to that board. It'll have you. They ask you to plunk in the name of the person you're going to see. They will then look up that person's name, and on there you can tell whether or not that person has been censured, sanctioned, or suspended. Some boards will tell you if they've had malpractice suits. Some boards will not. Malpractice suit just means you can't get insurance for malpractice if you've done something egregious. And you will be sanctioned, and you will be censured, and you might even be suspended. So it's worth it to look it up. But let's go on a little bit because I think we've digressed a bit.
Okay.
So there are different kinds of psychologists. There's child psychologists, there's educational psychologists, and there's clinical psychologists, which is pretty much the highest level because you need special and extra training to help with all different levels of emotional distress from mild to severe. Divorce, death of a spouse, death of a child, emotional distress, severe emotional distress, depression, anxiety, OCD. This is what clinical psychologists do.
So what's the difference between a clinical psychologist and a regular psychologist?
Well, regular psychologist has not gotten that additional training to become a clinical psychologist. So as a clinical psychologist, you have to have different additional training than just being a generic psychologist. Then there's a neuropsychologist. We're going to move on to the neuropsychologist. Neuropsychologist has training and experience in doing testing. Testing done by a psychologist is recognized as the gold standard by the courts. Trained to help with all levels of emotional distress as a result of head trauma, cognitive rehabilitation, to retrain the brain, to use parts of the brain that take over from areas of the brain that are not healthy. Now, just to give you an idea, I have these 2 doctoral degrees, both clinical psychology and neuropsychology, and I put together, if you will, the clinical aspect of helping the person to cope with the emotional distress caused by, let's say, a head injury, or by dementia or stroke, or by just depression. So it puts together those 2 degrees. So just to give you an idea, we just talked about 200,000 people at the master's level, different licensed counselor, child, marriage, family, and child counselor, and MSW. In the history of the last 75 years, there have been only 17,000 people who have been able to license as psychologists in the state of California. And the license itself is a generic license called a psychology license.
How many people do clinical neuropsychology, like the two combined?
Probably half a dozen, maybe a dozen. In Orange County, maybe a half a dozen or a dozen in LA, and half a dozen or a dozen in San Francisco. It's very rare because it's rare that somebody would go on to that second degree. It's also very rare because it's very rigorous. And it used to be, just a male bastion. When I started, there were only one other neuropsychologist I knew who was a female, and I didn't know any clinical neuropsychologist, male or female, at the time.
So it's a bit of a boys' club, is what you're saying.
It was at the time, but I don't think it is that way now at all.
So you think it's improved for women in that field over the years? Or?
Yeah, it has improved because I think that the opportunities are more there. I mean, I can remember, I'll tell you a story from my practice. I can remember when I was publishing, and at first when I was writing journal articles and publishing, they were telling women to just put their initials at the beginning.
Oof.
And not put their first names because they were more likely to be rejected by the journal's peer review board.
That's depressing to
hear. But now that's not the case at all. So, I mean, what was then and what's now is very different. Mm-hmm. Now I'm going to move on to the highest level of training and experience, and that's a psychiatrist. And a psychiatrist is first a medical doctor. And what they can do is they can prescribe. They're usually affiliated with a hospital or a nursing home. Most of the time, psychiatrists do not do therapy per se. They do medical checks, what are called med checks, to check on the medication because they are able, with their degree, to prescribe medication. They do not do psychological testing. And if they do psychological testing, because it will not be accepted by the court. And I can tell you from my own personal experience, I have gone into court against psychiatrists, and the first question I make the attorney ask is, what medical school trained you to do psychological testing? And the answer is, no medical school trains you to do psychological testing. So psychological testing and neuropsychological testing are the bailiwick, or if you will, the sole proprietary of psychologists.
So does anyone do psychiatry and clinical psychology, or is it pretty much separate?
Well, they're separate. And I have met psychiatrists who have gone back and become psychologists. I had one in school with me when I was there. But that's very, very rare. Very, very rare. So let me go back to psychiatrists so that we can finish up with them. They are trained to see patients with severe emotional distress. Keep in mind that they can prescribe medication, and that is mostly what they do now. Although right now in the state of California, any physician can prescribe psychotropic drugs. And so I kind of think that psychiatrists are getting squeezed out to some extent. There are currently 6,500 practicing psychiatrists in the state of California.
Interesting. Let's go over just if you had a certain problem, who would you want to maybe go to? So let's say that you're having an issue in the family. What would be the best path for that?
So if it's strictly a family issue, let's just say the family is falling apart and you're thinking that, we might wind up in divorce court, or you're already at the point where you're in divorce court and the issue is going to be who gets custody of the child. How do you work it out? You probably should wind up with a marriage, family, and child counselor. That probably would be best. If one of the persons, give you a different example, if one of the persons doesn't want the divorce and starts to become depressed, they should wind up with a psychiatrist, but most likely with a psychologist who does therapy. Psychologists do therapy for moderate to severe emotional distress.
So you think that if someone's seeing a psychiatrist, they should also go see a clinical psychologist?
They usually work together.
Okay. If I have insurance, though, how does the insurance company get a list together? How does that work?
Well, anybody who signs a contract with them is on their list. Whether this person is experienced, not experienced, good, bad, or indifferent, you're going to get just the person in the order in which the insurance company has recommended people before. So if the person is number 35 on the list, the next one, 36, is going to be yours.
So you just recommend doing your own research and not letting the insurance companies do it for you?
I would hardly recommend that. This is probably one of the most important decisions in your life, to get to understand the system and pick the right therapist for yourself.
All right, let's take some questions from the audience. This week's questions come from Facebook. We're going to be taking questions from the audience each week, and each week we'll try to get through at least 3 of them. Today we're going to be talking about personality tests. Paul from Minneapolis, Minnesota asks, what do you think about personality tests? Specifically, I'm interested in the Myers-Briggs test, but feel free to elaborate on others as well.
That's a really good question, because personality tests are basically 3 different kinds. There's tests of personality, there's tests of intellect, and there's neuropsych testing, and they all do different things. Personality tests run every place from those that have good validity, which means they really do test what it seems like they're testing, to those who have no validity. They are also, some of them, relationship tests that are given to people by MFCs, for instance, because they're looking at how compatible are 2 people. They don't have hugely high validity. The test that has the best validity amongst the personality tests is one called the MMPI. The MMPI is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. I know it's hugely worded. It was developed during World War II by the military to be able to weed out those that they felt were not suitable for the service. And it has been researched. It's used in over 90 countries. The Russians use it to pick cosmonauts. We use it to pick astronauts. We use it. Every major corporation uses some form of that test to pick its top executives. It's used in prisons. It's used in mental health hospitals. So the MMPI is, if you're going to do a personality test, that would be the one I'd be looking at, because it has what is called a normative group, which means you take a whole bunch of people without psychological problems. You give them the test and look and see how they do, and then you're compared against that normative group. The next type of test is a test of intellect, and this is things like the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, or the Stanford Binet, the KABC Kaufman tests, and these tests measure your intellect compared to other people. There's also one that is given to people who do not speak English, and it has no verbal content. It has kind of like been a little discarded, because they found that people who took it who don't speak English do just as poorly on that as they do in a test that is in English. So those are the intelligence tests. And then you get neuropsych testing. And those are the Lurie, Nebraska is the big baby of that one. That's the big one. And it looks at different, on the Wisconsin card sort, and all different tests like this. They're all little subtests of the Lurie, Nebraska. And what they're looking at is what parts of the brain are functioning and what parts of the brain are not functioning as well as they should, or not functioning at all. And so that covers all different types of tests. I hope that answered your question.
So what do you think about IQ tests?
I think they have a place, because you want to know if the person is capable of doing more work. For instance, I can tell you from personal experience that when I was very young, I had to take an IQ test in, I think it was junior high, and my mother got called in and she said, I think the teacher said, "Your daughter's a severe underachiever." It's like, okay. Wow. So my parents obviously got after me and then God knows that I went ahead and just outstreamed whatever they thought it was going to happen. So I think they have a place because you want to put people in classes, or at least it's my own personal bent, is you want to put people in a classroom who can function pretty much at the same level so that the teacher can provide the best possible information. If the teacher is working with 12 different levels, I'm not really sure that they have the time or the energy to specifically help each of the people at each different level. So, and the other thing is that if there has been a decrement, and that means a decrease in the intellect, let's say you had a head injury.
Right.
The first thing the court would do is say, Dr. Iger, could you please administer this test and give us an idea if there's a decrement? And yes, I can tell you that there is the test of intellect will tell as well, if there's been a decrement. You can also tell whether somebody's faking on these tests. And I can remember being in court, one of my little court stories, with a guy who had been in prison and was suing the government because he said that he was now retarded, and that was his word, and that he couldn't talk, so he said he had aphasia. I can't talk better than this, which I had heard him out in the waiting room discussing with his friend how they were going to kill their neighbor's dog. And he said he was claiming that he had a 69 IQ. And I had looked through his medical records, and I was sure that was not the case. He had had a drug business before he went into, pretty big one, before he went into prison. So I told the judge that I thought that he was malingering and that he was, I think I used the word malingering. Mm-hmm. And I think if you have a 69 IQ, you don't know what that word means. And guy turned around, this prisoner, and he said, I wasn't nice, and he tried to launch himself off the table at me, wow. which he had a bailiff sitting behind him, and the bailiff grabbed him, and the judge came down off this bench and said, Doctor, it's always exciting when you're in court.
Wow. So, how can you tell when someone's faking in that situation?
Well, in that situation, he wouldn't have known what that word meant.
Yeah, but is there any sort of criteria for...
Yeah, it's funny because that's why you almost always, when you're going to give a test of intellect, the courts will want to see that MMPI. Remember I talked to you about that? The MMPI has 4 validity scales on it, and it can tell right away if you're faking. Mm-hmm. So if you pass the MMPI and you're sitting there doing a WAIS, a test of intelligence, and I see that there's no disparity, then I think you're probably being accurate. There are ways to tell on even the WAIS-R, the WAIS-4, if somebody is faking.
Do people often fake those tests, or is that...
Oh, when there's money involved, yes, they do. Yes, they do. Courts often will call me, attorneys often call me and say, hey, Dr. Iger, would you look at this testing? Because we don't want to be stuck with this person in court if we think that they're lying, or on the other hand, if they're representing the person, and I've had attorneys do that, or if on the other hand, I'm looking at it and I say, no, this is valid testing, then they could feel pretty assured that they're going to be able to come through court pretty okay.
Mm-hmm. Are they usually pretty sophisticated in how they do it, or is it usually pretty obvious?
I think that's depending on the level of sophistication and intelligence of the person who's trying to fake it. Mm-hmm. I mean, somebody who's very sophisticated is going to try and fake it at a much better level. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I can honestly say that I think my colleagues and I have done a really good job of being able to pick out when somebody is, faking a test, malingering, we're pretty good at doing it.
So in summary, you're skeptical of the Myers-Briggs.
Well, the Myers-Briggs doesn't have all the validity that I would like. It's not necessarily the type of personality test than the MMPIs. I just think I would, if I were going to spend money on a test,
Mm-hmm.
I would spend money on the big daddy. And the big daddy of personality tests is definitely the MMPI.
Okay. If someone just wants to do it for fun, they take a free test, free Myers-Briggs test online. Is there necessarily any harm in that, or?
Well, it's my grandmother's pop psychology is what I call it.
Yeah.
You don't know how to interpret it really. Mm-hmm. A lot of these will give you some meaning, and then a lot of people get worried or anxious or perseverate and go, oh my God, I've got this problem with that. I mean, it's kind of like right now when you look on TV and you see all these ads for all these medications, at the end of that, aren't you thinking, gee, maybe I better check in with my doctor to see if I'm sick?
Ask your doctor if Flexidor is right for you.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly what I'm talking about. And so taking these tests, I think without, in the wrong setting, number one, unless they're given in a standardized setting, in a standardized manner, they're not valid anyway. So if you're taking it at home and you've got noise in the house and you're alone, nobody can use that test because we don't know that you did it. And we don't know that you aren't disturbed and you didn't take 14 breaks. I mean, if you're doing it in the psychologist's office, you are doing the test, period.
So it's actually useful in that situation, whereas there's really not much point in just
No, it's, I think it's informative. I think people, for fun, but I would never recommend somebody takes an MMPI for fun because then they have to wait a year until they can take it again.
Yeah.
And so it ruins the validity of it, and you don't want to do that. You just, because it is the big daddy. In disability, they ask for 2 tests. They ask for the test of intelligence, and they, like the WAIS, and then they ask for the MMPI, and they ask for them together. So if disability wants that, I'm talking about Social Security disability, if they want that, there's a lot of science behind it for them to want those 2 tests.
So we have a couple more questions we're going to try to get to, but at least one more. This one comes from Reve in Fullerton, California. She asks that I heard that our fear of spiders and snakes is actually directly related to seeing someone else, maybe a mentor or a parent, be scared of them. And is there any truth to that?
There is not only truth to it, but this is how we learn. You didn't learn to ride a bicycle by reading about bicycles.
Yeah.
You didn't learn to pick up a fork and learn how to use a fork by that. That's called modeling. Our parents model for us the way the world works. So if your parents modeled for you a fear of spiders or snakes, then you were more likely to be afraid of spiders and snakes. I'll give you an idea about some for my own practice. I remember somebody coming in and saying, oh my God, I've got all these things from my parents. What do I do now? And this was an adult, a young adult. And I said, well, the nice thing is that as you grow up, you can redefine reality. So if your mother told you when you were 3 that the sky was purple and white striped, somewhere along the line, I mean, it's not funny because parents are sometimes this off on reality.
Oh, yeah, no, it actually does happen.
And you now know that it's blue. You can redefine it as blue. And you could, this is about mental health. This is why people go to therapists, psychologists in particular, to learn how to redefine reality with what is rather than what they've been taught or erroneously picked up.
So you think that not only is this true, but it's definitely just a natural phenomenon.
Well, that's how we learn. I mean, we don't necessarily, I think I taught learning theory, and in that, I used to tell my class, people would assume that at least 80 or 90% of your learning comes from books. The truth is that 80 and 90% of your learning comes from modeling. Somebody else did it and you did it. That's how you learn to do it. Like riding a bicycle.
Interesting.
Driving a car. You didn't read your textbook on driving a car.
Well, I did, but I also had to get behind the wheel. Yeah.
You read the book on how your car works after you learned how to drive your car. Hopefully, you didn't take the textbook and go, okay, I'm going to hope you didn't do that.
So, and you did want to tackle that?
Sure.
Okay. So a common perception is that this actually ties into how racism travels from parents to kids. Is there any validity to that as well?
Absolutely. If you grow up in a household where racism and you hear all these epithets about different races and religions and sexual orientations and gender, if you hear these things from your parents as being okay, probably you're more likely, it's almost like contagion, to get those views. But again, as you get older, you get the privilege of redefining yourself and redefining reality as you know it. So if, for instance, your parents are prejudiced and you don't feel that way, as an adult, you could say, I just don't agree with that.
All right, that actually got pretty deep. I think that's actually good for today. So we'll leave it at 2. But we have plenty more questions to get to next week and on the weeks from there. If you want to send us a question, the links for that are in the description.
Please send your questions, because that way we know, A, you're listening, and B, we know what you want to know. Ask your questions about how the brain works. Ask your questions about what depression is. Ask your questions about what anxiety is. Ask your questions about head injuries. Ask your questions about if your grandmother's had a stroke, what now? Ask your questions about dementia. Is Alzheimer ever going to be cured? I mean, there's a billion questions you could ask, and there's no charge. Hey, ask here. We'll tell you the answer.
Free shrink. All right, that about wraps it up for this episode of The Brain Podcast, the one and only official podcast of The Brain. If you have any questions or any feedback, you can follow us on social media. Links are in the description. And also, you can send us an email at lindaigercast@gmail.com. That's LINDAIGERcast@gmail.com. Or send us a voicemail or text message at 775-468-3444.
This podcast is copyright 2018, Dr. Linda Eiger and Lars Householder. If you wish to use a clip from the show, or if you have another business inquiry, please email us at the aforementioned address.